Welcome to another episode of New Wine Uncorked. I'm Matt Farlow, and I'm here with my friend Jay. So to talk again about cultural issues, and I just wanted to allow Jay to introduce himself briefly, and then we'll just have the conversation, a little bit more dialogue.
All right, very cool. Yeah, my name is Jay Ho. Originally from Taiwan, actually. I was born there, came to the U.S. when I was 1.5. Spent the bulk of my life down in Southern California. The big joke is that I'm a west of the 405er, so always in the Santa Monica, Culver City, West LA area. But about 2.5 years ago, I moved up back to Northern California. I did my undergrad at Davis, and it was just time to come back up north. So
Yeah, but just because, Santa Monica, LA, and NorCal, two different cultures, correct?
very different. Yeah, very different.
So
Yeah.
it's interesting because, you talk about Taiwanese and that background, but then I think a lot of people outside of California don't realize the different cultures of California.
It's pretty substantial. I mean, from San Diego to Orange County to Los Angeles, even within Los Angeles itself, it's not really, people used to call it the melting pot, but it's not really a melting pot. I call it more of a tossed salad, because the groups still kind of stay in their weird pockets.
Yeah.
And there's no real melting or gelling going on. So, yeah.
It's so crazy because then when I laugh because outside of California, like I'll say NorCal and they're like, oh, what do you mean? I'm like, well, NorCal is different than SoCal, and there are two different, it is. And like you said, then when you get down to San Diego,
Yeah.
is quite interesting. I don't know if you've seen on the news talk about San Diego, where there's I think it was, I can't remember exactly what part of Southern Cal, but an hour outside of where the president was doing a rally, like
Okay.
they huge spike in COVID-19
Oh,
cases. And so I know people think when they see the numbers for California, the numbers for COVID are exceptionally high. And yet
right.
up here in Northern California, it's not quite as dramatic, right?
Yeah, it's not quite as bad. I feel like, well, especially in Sacramento and El Dorado County, it's less bad than everywhere else. I think it's partially because we're more spread out as well.
Sure.
So we tend to be a little bit less. I mean, it's been interesting because I still have a lot of connections back into the West LA world, and everybody, the whole mindset's different in terms of everybody staying indoors. And even a few weeks ago, my girlfriend and I and our daughter went to Stinson Beach, which is just right north of San Francisco. And over there, people were staring us down because we weren't wearing masks outdoors. But everybody in the Bay Area is very diligent about wearing their masks. Whereas in El Dorado County, we're out hiking and doing our things outdoors without masks, but going inside, stores and whatnot with. So
Talk about the COVID stuff. That affects you personally because your kids are in another country.
Yeah.
Canada in this, but the COVID is affecting the way in which you can then visit, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So the official order and the lockdown happened the week before spring break with my kids. And I was supposed to go up to Toronto and pick them up and drive them down to Washington, D.C. for a week in D.C. But the lockdown blocked that. And just 2 weeks ago, the Canadian border is allowing immediate family to travel across the border. So yeah, I'll be seeing them in 2 weeks. So I'm going to Canada instead of them coming here this year. So it's a little bit different, but.
Which is so with that, like with the COVID stuff, like how do you think, the strictness, in San Francisco compared to, you haven't been up to Canada yet since this has happened, have you?
No, I'll be there on July 11th. I'm heading out there.
And obviously with the quarantine and you have to strict rules that you have to go through.
Exactly. So basically my ex-wife and I decided that when I get there, I'm going to quarantine with the kids for 15 days and then I'll fly back. So I basically, got a massive Airbnb so we can play indoors with a backyard. Otherwise it'd be really kind of rough, with my kids indoors for 2 weeks.
Yeah. So have you spent a lot of time in Canada? Like what's that culture?
Yeah. Toronto's interesting. I feel like Canada is far more accepting of different races and cultures and religions than the US is. The analogy that I used earlier for Los Angeles in terms of more of a salad bowl than a melting pot only came to me when I visited Toronto. Toronto is a very, very culturally religious mixed town. And then the city borders within, or the section borders within Toronto are so tight that you can go from Chinatown to, I guess it's called Beantown to Jamaican Town, and it just flows and everybody just hangs out. And there's no, I don't feel it, at least when I'm there, there's less of a If you're in a different neighborhood, they don't look at you weird, less of a cultural difference.
Yeah.
Well, the cultural differences that aren't as prominent, I suppose,
Okay.
because we're accepting as a whole. One of the things I noticed moving back into out of Los Angeles into El Dorado County is that I do get looks on occasion when I'm out and about. El Dorado County is predominantly white. There's a whole section that wants to be state of Jefferson. And, you know, I'm walking around looking very, you know, surfy, beachy, liberal, I suppose. So yeah, I do get certain looks. So it's kind of interesting.
Because you and I were talking about this earlier about speaking of race stuff, the idea of the model minority.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Yeah, the model more, yeah, that's an interesting one. So, you know, I think a lot of people think of Asians as a whole as a model minority. And I don't like that thought as a whole because, first of all, Asian isn't really a thing, right? Asian was something that was made up post the idea of Oriental sounding racist. This is going to sound really strange. I prefer Oriental because it actually covers China, Korea, and Japan. But if you say Asian, it actually covers Pakistan and India and all these other nations that when people think of Asian, they don't think of those other countries. They only think of the Pacific Rim, the three major countries in the Pacific Rim. So yeah, that's a little bit wonky. And then in terms of model minority, you know, there's, not to sound horrible, but there's just as much crime in the Asian community, if not white collar, but, you know, just as gang violence related as any other culture that's out there actually in the US that I've seen at least. So.
well, and it's weird because how we were talking in like this idea of a model, any, you know, person, you know, a model race, and especially when dealing with cultural differences or people who are different, depending on, I guess, where they're born. I guess that's what it's meaning, right? Model, because if someone's born in America but has, you know, Taiwanese background or Chinese background, it's like, can they be a model minority, I guess, depending on what culture they're in? Because if you get into higher education or from China or, you know, folks from Japanese background probably are more found in higher ed than someone who's Black or Mexican.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, partially that's an interesting one because that's a mixture of what's the thing that they used back in the day for
like action stuff.
Yeah. Affirmative action and all that sort of jazz. That was interesting. That played against me when I was applying for university because, you know, they had to make sure that there was only certain segments that were allowed in. But on the flip side, I don't really see it as a bad or good thing in a weird sense because my grades weren't super stupendously strong. So it was just one of those things where I didn't want to be clumped in, but I also knew that I needed to stand by my own merits to get into school. So I understand the concept of affirmative action, and I think it's great to have representation across the board. But I don't know if there's any right or wrong way to bring cultures together in that sense. And I think it's actually, I mean, in hindsight, it's actually a good thing because I think it blends more people together. But I also know a lot of people called affirmative action reverse racism because there was a lot of Asians that weren't able to get into school. There was a lot of other people that weren't able to get into universities because of it. But in the flip side, I feel like certain cultures have had so much chaos and dismay that they kind of, I don't see it being a wrong thing, giving them a foot up to get a step into a better, you know, situation, for lack of a better way of saying it.
Yeah. And it's interesting, you know, I've talked to a lot of people about the idea of, you know, affirmative action for folks for races or cultures that are oppressed, you know. I find it interesting, and I don't know how much talk you've had with even like your ex-wife up in Canada, or even with folks in your friends in LA, but the pushback, or especially from the white culture, with a problem with Black Lives Matter movement, as if that's denying that all lives matter. You know,
I don't see it that way, though. I mean, I think I can see why people would say that. I don't think
people feel that way a lot of times, you know?
Yeah. I think people feel that way because they get stuck in their corners, though. Like they want to raise their hand and say, look, I matter too. And I don't think the movement is saying that other people don't matter.
Yeah.
I think they're just calling out the fact that Black people in general have been so repressed in American society for so long that it's just time for them to get what they're due. I mean, post Martin Luther King and, you know, Malcolm X and the whole initial civil rights movement, I feel like they were heard, And the civil rights movement furthered America to a certain degree. And then racism became a bad thing. I hate to
Yeah.
use quote unquote. So everybody started hiding, their racism and
Yeah.
just trying to be PC, which is unfortunate too. So it kind of made the uncomfortable conversations hard to have.
Totally.
Yeah.
You and I have had conversations about faith, and
Right.
religion, and then even with this, we've talked about cultural backgrounds and the race thing. And I was mentioning to you about that you said you saw on the news too. The Breakfast Club had the story about the student who was asked to change her name,
Right.
and her name, I think it was like it sounded like Fook Boy, and
Yeah.
and this is a thing I've never heard of, and I've taught higher education for quite some time, but the professor asked her to Anglinize
Yeah.
her name, and now when I was asking you, because I've known you by as Jay, but you
Right.
how when you grew up, that's your
Yeah.
friend.
That's an interesting one. Growing up in the US, my full name is Zun-Jay, and it's
Yeah.
translated over from Mandarin, which is Zun-Jay. So that was actually translated over by my one of my kindergarten teachers when I was a kid. But growing up with a different name, you tend to be made fun of a little bit. And I remember going through a slight identity crisis where I wanted to change my name to Alex, and then I wanted to change my name to Steve. And I'm very thankful now that I never did, because Zun-Jay is kind of a cool name. And I just happened to be lucky enough to have a Chinese name that was able to be translated into English without sounding too funny, for lack of a better way of saying it. So it makes it easy. But I also do recognize friends that have grown up with names that are funnier sounding, and they've had a harder time with it.
Yes.
But yeah.
Do you think I wonder if today is, I mean, I thought today was becoming more accepted. Yeah, or told. The professor actually used that language to Anglinize because it's offensive. I mean, if that's a bummer to me, because then when they show a picture of the professor and he's white, I'm like, dude, all these,
Yeah.
and that's a hard thing with this the racial discussion, because I don't want to be judged by white people who are closed in with their thoughts,
Right.
and you probably don't want to be judged by everyone who appears to be Asian or is Asian, and then you're like, well, we're not all the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
No, and I understand that people need to stereotypes exist for a reason, right? And I understand that. So you're gonna see me and right away think I'm Asian, and I'm okay with that. That's not a big deal. But for me, it's more about the direct respect you have for the person. So if you come to me respectfully and ask me questions about culture, race, my life, whatever, I'm pretty much an open book. And as you know, Matt, I'm willing to talk about anything.
yeah,
But I think I'm also a pretty good judge of character. So if somebody comes at me disrespectfully, it's pretty apparent, So I'm at that point, I'd rather just stay away. I'm not confrontational in that sense. I mean, I will stand my ground, but if somebody's being a total dick, then I'll do something about it. But if they're just going to be, passing by, then it's not worth my time.
well,
So.
and that's, I think, at least what this time is, and I don't know how you feel about this because your kids are a little bit younger than mine, but I almost feel like sometimes the pendulum has swung so far that we become so sensitive.
Yeah.
If I say something that offends you, instead of you saying, dude, that was just a dumbass thing to say, or hey bro, that was like, you shut me out. Or they do this now, I didn't even know this is a term, I can't remember now, I'm gonna mess it up. It's something where like online on Twitter, like they share bad information about someone, and then everyone goes off, and I think it's dinging, or yeah, I don't know. My son knows it. He's on. But basically, they go after the person on Twitter or Facebook, and they just crush them.
Okay.
That they said, where sometimes I wonder if the aspect of dialogue is so lost, and so we become so sensitive to where if you say something incorrect, and sometimes I think people say things and they just don't know that it's.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't think before they talk, first of all. And then secondly, I think the social media and online has created this culture of being able to hide behind a screen. Yeah. And the loudest voices, you can be the most liberal voice, you can be the most, redneck voice, you can be super green, you can be super right, whatever it might be. Whoever yells the loudest seems to be the one that wins. And that's kind of this weird online culture aspect of things. So flame wars happen and all that jazz. And I don't think I think it's created a level of disrespect.
Totally.
And it's also created a weird ability for people that didn't have the voice before to be able to speak out. And even if it's a dark voice, that's not, good for people in general. So
Yeah, sorry, go on.
yeah, I would just imagine that a lot of these people face to face wouldn't have the wherewithal to be able to speak their mind in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
And I honestly don't have any problems across the board with whatever you want to believe. I just want to understand. And if somebody doesn't have the same belief that I do, I asked for understanding purposes. And I think that comes around more respectfully than asking in different ways. And it's just, I think people need to be taught that sort of skill set to be able to speak as well as be able to listen. And I think that's kind of a lost art in the past,
Where do you think you learned how to dialogue? Like, where did that come from on wanting to understand who's in front of you?
That's interesting. I think growing up as a kid, I was kind of misunderstood. I kind of started growing into myself more in middle school. And then when I got into high school, I took a peer counseling class where it was just about listening to other people. And so all through Santa Monica High School, I was a peer counselor from like every other semester. And then even when I was at Davis, I did peer counseling for, 2 quarters just to understand people.
Yeah.
Me personally, I like to hear people's stories. I've learned that not just in my personal world, but in the professional setting, if you get to know who the people are, you can understand the context they're coming from and you can collaborate better. And for me as a profession, I'm a project manager, I build processes, I do all that sort of stuff. So I can't do that in a bubble and I can't do it myopically because that means I'm not understanding what is surrounding me and what needs to occur. I think a lot of people step into jobs, roles, relationships only within their own small vision of or a smaller worldview.
Yeah.
End up being stuck. And I can't judge them for that because a lot of people grow up with a smaller worldview, so they just don't understand. But I'm here to talk to people about anything. So if anybody wants to understand, let's talk.
Which is so interesting because we all say, oh yes, dialogue or talking to each other is good, and we need to learn how to listen.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about this because I've been reading some stuff about a personhood and who we are. And it's one thing to listen. And I did this when I was going through my doctoral work and I was looking into merging theology with the theater. One of the things that really struck me was this idea of acceptance. Like on the theater in improvisation, you must accept the other's acts because it's like jazz.
Yeah.
Another. Yeah. But you can't allow the scene to move if you're not willing to be fluid enough to accept each other.
Yeah, I can see that.
So drawing that into then personhood and who we are, if you're not willing to be open in receiving it's one thing for me to listen to you.
Yeah.
But if I'm not receiving what you're saying, then while you're talking, I can say I'm listening, but I'm already, coming up with my response to. And so I wonder, with dialogue, if we need to then almost retrain ourselves how to not just listen, but to receive the person in front of us.
Yeah. So one of the things that you're taught in counseling is to reflect, right?
Yeah.
So if somebody says something, you reflect back to them what they're saying to try to understand it, but not in the same words. And that's just one of the, I don't know, maybe it's just gotten so ingrained in me that I don't think about it.
Yeah.
But I think when I talk to people, I always want to regurgitate a little bit of what they're saying so I understand what they're saying if I'm even slightly confused. So I think that just helps open up conversation a little bit more.
Yeah. So are you teaching your kids that? Like, do you think that?
Trying to. My daughter's, she's 11. She hit not puberty, but I guess, she had her first womanly incident last year, actually pretty early. So she's in her preteen era right now. So she's kind of hard to talk to, but I'm trying to teach her to open up, quite honestly. I know that I'm not saying this in a bad way, but my ex-wife's family isn't as verbal and they're not as, they're more, they put more walls too. And I'm more of the type, like, if we have a problem, let's get through it. Let's talk about it. If it's hard, we'll hold off on it, but we'll come back to it later on. But it's better to let it out instead of holding it in. Because I think if you hold something in, that's when things grind.
Oh, yeah, totally. I mean, it's interesting because with my family, and this is my wife and I, like when I entered her family, they're much more of a bottle it up kind of.
Oh, okay.
And my family is half and half. So where my mom is very emotional, wear it on your sleeve, like, you know, let's show your emotions. But my dad, it wasn't until I think my senior year that I ever saw him
Hmm.
show a sign of like sadness or tears, you know. But he grew up. His dad died in a car accident when he was 15.
Wow.
So he has grown up kind of
Stoic?
yeah, very much so. Very, and he's an engineer. So again, I
Okay.
type horrible, but sometimes he fits the engineer model, right? Like
Right, right. So right when you said that, I stereotyped, which is horrible, right? But you hear engineer, and I know, like, you know, right away they're more meticulous and they're more quiet and they're more anyways, yeah,
joke is, so my kids are getting to know him.
yeah.
The joke was is they my son was asking him saying, "Hey pops, are you organized?" And I said, "Funny thing, I bet if you asked him to open his underwear and sock drawers, they would be organized to where, you know, the socks do not mix."
Yeah,
Also, he used to do that when we were kids, but now they make actually dressers with drawers that are already itemized.
yeah, yeah.
And so it's funny. I mean, and I think the way to get away from stereotypes being so pejorative sometimes is to talk through it, right?
Right, absolutely, absolutely.
So when I saw him cry the first time, it was shocking to me. I was like,
Oh,
oh wow, because I grew up where you sort of, if you got knocked down, especially as a guy, you
you
just
get
get
up.
back up, you
Yeah.
know. And I think part of the reason why I ended up wrestling was because I was smaller, you
Mhm.
know, and so it was one of the ways to learn how to fight, you know, because
Absolutely, yeah.
you're
It's a good way.
on,
Yeah, yeah.
made fun of. And so it's like, so I wonder with how all of that pours into, like, how do we break through that to teach people, hey, emotions are good. Yes, they could get,
Yeah.
because we're seeing the play of emotions and passion, whether it's in the Black Lives Matter movement or the push against the Black Lives Matter and the protesting from All Lives Matter, whatever you want to say,
Right.
emotional in a passionate way, which is good. But I don't know if anyone's taught us how to then to use that, you know, and to harness it in
Yeah.
positive ways.
Like emotional IQ and whatnot. I mean, that's one of those things that aren't taught in school, right? And if it's not taught at home, then you're not going to grow up with it. Um, it's interesting to me because I've had a lot of friends say that I have high emotional IQ. And I'm thinking back to my childhood. My parents weren't the typical Chinese family, but they kind of were. You know, my dad was kind of stoic. My mom was, she and I were really close. They weren't typical in the sense that they didn't care. They weren't the tiger parents, like they cared about my grades. They were more like, if you're happy, then it's all good. I don't care what sort of grades you get, as long as you're happy. Which kind of pissed off all my other Chinese friends because they're just like, you know, yeah, they were pressured hardcore.
Yeah.
Um, but I think it's a mixture of my parents raising me a little bit more open, as well as me just you know, through peer counseling, I guess, and various other bits where I just like hearing people's stories. And I think part of being able to articulate as well as listen and as well as be able to understand people better is this, maybe it's compassion. I don't know. Maybe I was taught more with compassion.
Well, I mean, so depending on translations, there's a part in the Bible where it says, where Jesus is quoted as saying, "Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect."
Yeah.
And in that language, it can be translated as compassion.
Yeah.
When this push toward perfection really is this push into compassion.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because for people, you know, from the Christian realm, Jesus, when he sees the crowds, it's common that he has compassion on them.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's something that's really missing right now in the world in general, is just compassion. I think people get stuck in their corners and, you know, and what kind of bothers me is I'm a believer of God. I have faith, and I see Christianity being used for bad, for lack of a better way of saying it. And, you know, the word, they claim to be Christian, but they also are highly racist and they don't see it. And
Yep.
I don't know where that, how they come to those terms with that. And I would love to honestly sit down with somebody like that and understand them. You know, how can they be that way and still call themselves one thing or another? Because I feel like as a Christian, as a believer of God, Jesus, of the Holy Spirit, you need compassion's core.
Yep.
Uh, you know, Jesus said that, I don't remember which parable it was, but you know, he went off and took care of that one person that wasn't doing well versus the rest of the group, and because he mattered. And that to me rings really true of the Black Lives Matter bit because there's one group of people that need more help than the majority, the whatever majority we want to talk about. And I'll even put myself in the majority because I feel like, and this is something my father told me when I was young, is that there was many sacrifices made from the civil rights movement, from African Americans that stood their ground, that actually helped all the rest of the cultures that were having a hard time in America. In the 1800s, there was a Chinese Exclusion Act after, we helped build the railroad from west to east. After they realized that we were taking jobs, they tried to kick us all out of the country. And somehow between that time and, the civil rights movement, Asians became the model minority somewhere in between there, because I guess we were quiet as a whole collectively. But that's not really, the right way to look at it, quite honestly.
Yeah.
I think people today look at their own lives and they forget history, right? Yeah. And the context of history really matters as to the people that are living now and what they have to go through. And something that you and I talked about too, in terms of the model minority bit and all that sort of jazz, that's interesting to me, is the idea of white privilege, right? I understand it partially because as a Chinese person in Asia, I'm a majority. So if I go to China or if I go to Taiwan, I won't experience the same isms, for lack of a better way of saying it, as somebody that's Hmong or somebody that's from Nepalese or somebody that's native Taiwanese, the Aboriginal. And it's not because I don't want to understand, it's because it's out of my purview. And I think people that typically, they don't understand white privilege because that's the life they've led. But if they realize that there's people have these other lives and their life experiences are different and they're willing to understand and listen, and you have compassion, that's when life actually helps. And that's when you start connecting with people. And I think, quite honestly, that's what's missing, right? So I don't, if somebody tells me that they don't believe in white privilege and they're white, I'll start, I can comfortably talk to somebody about that and kind of express what it means versus what, my life experience has been being Chinese and what I've experienced with my African-American friends and my Latin friends. My ex-wife was Chilean, so she's, South American descent. And we got a lot of weirdness too when we were in Southern California, because a Chinese guy and a Latin girl look weird together. And my kids are very Chinese looking. So when my ex-wife was pushing the kids to the park, everybody thought she was the nanny.
Oh, right.
So, yeah. So there's, obviously that was it's partially stereotype, it's partially white privilege, it's partially all these different things. And we had a hard time dissecting that. And, it's just, I don't know. It's all about respect and compassion, quite honestly.
That's why I've gotten, because my son and I have been reading, he's been reading some psychologists and philosophers, and the idea of the other and personhood, being, ontology. And I've been talking with him on this issue. We've been really trying to digest everything that's going on, especially from a faith perspective, because I went off to get the degree to help lead the church, and I think I totally agree with you that the lack of compassion, we say we care about the other, and everyone's all, jazzed because Facebook is woke, whatever you want to call it, because they now have the care, reaction. Oh, and yet just because you tap a button doesn't mean that you really care, and so it's like, this is where I've been trying to step into maybe one step further for people to understand compassion, is that understanding of receiving the person.
Yeah.
I have to receive you as who you are, not to change you, but to understand you, because,
Absolutely. Yeah.
Dr. King said when one of his speeches talks about the measure of a man and the ought of humanity, that you cannot be who you ought to be, if I'm not who I ought to be, and I cannot be who I ought to be until you are who you ought to be. And that's not change one another. What it is it's recognizing that we're all directly or indirectly linked.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And back to the truth of, and so this is where I'm talking with my son, and even in this, going back to origin, like, who is the person, and creation. And so from a Christian standpoint, the idea of Imago Dei, created in the image of God, that's a creation of love and a creation of relationality. We need each other.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what I feel like I oversimplify, or maybe it's not a bad thing. I mean, I oversimplify Christianity, right? For me, it's about one love. For me, it's about the Ten
Really?
Commandments. And for me, it's about just taking care of your neighbors and just being a good person. I know I've had conversations with you about it and other people about it. And I feel like humans have put or changed it into something that isn't quite what it's supposed to be. And there's that whole idea of Jesus culture, what would Jesus do and whatnot. And I think that's a beautiful thing to a certain extent, because what Jesus in my mind would do is a lot of what people that claim to be Christian now wouldn't, wouldn't be cool.
Totally.
And that's the shocking part for me.
Yeah, I wonder, and this is because you had mentioned one time when we started talking about getting and you coming in talking with me about this was in reaction to a post where you said a black family was moving into your neighborhood.
Yeah.
James Worthy, and
Yeah.
like all of a sudden people's perception changed. And I don't know if you read anything or heard anything from Professor Cornel West. He's a professor in I think Harvard, or maybe Emeritus. But what he said is one of the things that's missed within this racial injustice is the economics.
Yeah, the economic side of it's definitely very interesting. So, I feel like you need economics and its status to a certain extent. Because, for example, one of my good friends, she's Nigerian, but she was born in the Bronx, but she moved back to Nigeria for, her formative years, basically, and did university there. So she moved back to the US maybe about 15 years ago, but she speaks with a Nigerian accent, but she's American. She's an American citizen. And, she's a working professional. And she used to drive a Honda CR-V to work all the time. And, I didn't think anything of it. But one day on a weekend, she and I went out and she pulled up in a nice BMW. And I'm like, what's going on, honey? Where's this car from? And she's like, I don't drive it to work because I don't want people to have a preconceived notion of, me having money and then asking me where I'm getting it from. And it's just interesting. So like when you said about the whole James Worthy story, here, I'll give you the quick lowdown. I grew up for a little bit in Westchester in Los Angeles, which is next to the Forum and all that jazz. And I grew up on a street that had actually Eddie Van Halen and a handful of movie producers and whatnot. And there was a house that was on sale. It was said that a black family was moving in. People were up in arms about it. And all of a sudden, when it was James Worthy, people were cool with it, which I was really shocked as a kid, because the middle school that I went to was really mixed, or elementary school and middle school. And he all of a sudden was okay because of not just his economic status, but his fame, right? Because Adi, my co-worker, my friend, obviously had the economic status to drive the BMW, but doesn't have the fame, or lack of a better way of saying, to go with it. So when she's driving it around, people still judge her. And I've known her to get pulled over because she's driving a nice car, which is, horrible. But I would imagine somebody like James Worthy will get pulled over and they're like, oh, he's James Worthy, and they'll let him go because of not just his economic stature, but also his fame.
Yeah. So, and there's a philosopher, and this is unfortunately how I think we live. Gosh, I think it was George Berkeley or someone like that who said, to be is to be perceived. And it sounds great. Oh yeah. But the problem is the way in which we are is how people perceive us.
Absolutely.
And so my wife, Kristen, she works at in the Los Rios school district. And one of the students was holding the door open, constantly holding it open to welcome people in. Okay. And one of my wife's coworkers, he was retelling the story. He asked the student, why are you doing that? And the student responded, because people see me, I'm Pakistani. And so I'm trying to show them that I'm nice and welcoming and not a terrorist.
Oh, how old's the kid?
She's a freshman at one of Los Rios, so community college,
Okay.
All right. This idea that what we perceive someone to be, is not
sad.
Isn't it? But isn't that how culture is,
Yeah.
And that goes, I think that's why when we talk about stereotypes, they're pejorative. Because usually that's what we perceive the person to be, but that's not who they are.
Yeah, absolutely not. I mean, this is going to be a really stupid example, but if you look back in films in the 90s, in the early 2000s, whenever there was like an international crime scene sort of thing, the terrorist was always of Middle Eastern descent, like one way or another. So recently I went back and rewatched the movie True Lies. Arnold Schwarzenegger, yeah, and the terrorist guy was, of Middle Eastern descent, and it was such a caricature going back and watching a film like that. and realizing that it made sense for the moment in time. But if we're trying to be better as a culture, we need to move beyond those stereotypes. But it's hard because not only does the media push it, but so does the entertainment media and everybody else to a certain extent. So
yeah, the media is part to blame for all of this. Not saying that what's happening with protest isn't necessary. It absolutely is. But they want the sensationalism.
They do. Yeah. I mean, that's what sells the news, right? That's what makes people go to one channel versus the next.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm thankful I haven't actually had broadcast TV since 2002. So it's been nice. Yeah.
Much better. I'm a news junkie, so I'm big this stuff, and just it's so overwhelming though, because for a lot of the protests, I am on board, and yes, we need to get a voice. My part that I somewhat am wrestling with is a lot of the statues, they should never have been erected. They should never have been put up.
Yeah.
Appropriate for us to just be tearing things down because that group wants to change it. Because my concern is what happens when the next group comes and they're bigger and stronger and they want to change something, instead of going through the policies. And I don't know, maybe the policies aren't where we can vote to take it down, or I feel like there's a movement towards accepting much more of the holistic history of America. So why couldn't we first go through the policies before tearing things down?
I think things are being, like you said, the pendulum's swinging one way. Things are happening in a brash manner. I don't completely agree with the whole tearing down of monuments to that extent. If you look back, if I remember history correctly, Robert E. Lee, the general from the South, wasn't for slavery. In fact, he was kind of against it, and he fought for it because he was a Southern plantation owner. But if I recall correctly, he himself was against slavery. So to tear down his statue is kind of a little bit of a weird thing because he was actually for the positive in that sense. But I understand to a certain extent why they're doing it. I think that we are missing out on history if we remove certain bad, symbols of, I guess, hate, for lack of a better way of saying it. I can understand the Confederate flag going away. That's not a big deal, but certain statues I think can be left as a historical statement and can be a learning experience.
Yeah, or maybe kept into a museum or something. Or
Exactly. So on the flip side, I did read something the other day where basically, in Germany, they don't have symbols of hate as their symbols. They have symbols of love erected post-Nazi Germany to celebrate what they want to be versus their past. And I think that's an interesting way of looking at it, right? Because the US, if they're erecting things that are talking about the past and it's not a happy past, then at this point in time, instead of just ripping them out and causing more strife and causing more divide, it should be a conversation, to your point, and a learning experience, and moved into museums, not just defaced and destroyed. Because I mean, that's
I've never understood statues anyways. So
neither.
To me, like, I don't have really much stock in the game, like stake in the game, because I'm like, take it down, keep it up. I mean, I understand if there are symbols of hate, and if it does, like, this is where I need the dialogue, because if it's super offensive, then we need to sit and go, oh, instead of pushing back against it, saying, oh no, we shouldn't tear it down, or being right up there and saying tear everything down, how about stop and talk first, and have the open, and maybe, and I have to be, open to acknowledge, hey, maybe folks have, because I know in the church setting, I've tried to have discussions about, hey, what about Jesus? What about our money? What about this? And you get completely crushed sometimes. But I don't know that until someone comes alongside me and says, hey, dude, here's what's happened. Let me show you this, and
the context.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And I think that happens though when we're willing to dialogue.
Yeah, I think it's better when we're willing to dialogue, for sure. I mean, so I read an article today that was kind of interesting, and basically it was from I think an LA Times staff writer, and it basically, the gist of it was that the LA freeway system is a monument to hate. And the way that the freeway system was built basically segregated Los Angeles and cut straight through the bad neighborhoods to keep them in a more lower position. Because people, what's that called? Homes that are built closer to highways technically usually are lower in value.
Yeah.
So when they built the freeway system, it was just straight through this beautiful neighborhood that was losing its panache basically and starting
Yeah.
to get more slummy. So they're like, well, we don't care. We're going to build this whole system through these bad neighborhoods because we want to keep them in a bad situation. But if we're swinging the pendulum so far, we're not going to go and tear down the whole freeway system because of its historical context. But in that same vein, I feel like it needs to be talked about and discussed. And so people understand why historically things were done that way, because I don't think anybody's going and thinking about why freeways are built, when and where and how at this point, at least, but it's definitely an interesting thought,
That conversation, I was telling you before, I was listening to Jon Stewart was with Charlemagne and the guys on the Breakfast Club, and he was talking, and they were all talking about, the idea of reparations would be money into the Black community so as to elevate, because if they were, which historically the way to keep people down, to oppress them, is to not allow them the advantages of education, which then into job and training. And the idea of reparations, of pouring into the Black communities with education and money for small businesses.
Yeah.
That's because we can't tear down 405,
No. Exactly.
But we could pour into those. And so one of the guys that works with New Wine, he's looking into gentrification, and the pushing out of the poor so that rich can come into these cities. And it's like, I think once we have those honest dialogues about money, which a lot of people don't like, especially in the church, that we start to get into, how can we allow for equitable solutions?
Equitable is a very key word. I think people don't realize equitable is what matters. Equality doesn't quite work. But yeah, that's another conversation.
So I totally appreciate you hanging out. We're gonna do this again.
Sure. Yeah.
Totally. Thanks for joining Jay and I here for another episode of New Wine Uncorked. Make sure you go right there on the bottom of the screen and hit subscribe, because like Jay was saying, there's so many other things that we could talk about. We're going to talk about equitable versus equality, and continue this conversation, because as you've noticed, like I've noticed, Jay has a ton of wise things to say. Continue to step into that. Jay, I totally appreciate you hanging out with me this afternoon, brother.
Thanks, man. My pleasure. My pleasure. Matt, I'll talk to you soon, okay?
I am Matt Farlow. This is my friend Jay, and this is New Wine Uncorked.
Take care.